Welcome to the Music History Project. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth Dale.
And Dan Del Fiorentino.
And Mike Mullins.
If you want to check out any of our content or any of the other interviews that aren't featured, please check out our website at www.nam.org/library. So we're new to this game, so it's a little awkward for us at first. But we're going to sit down today and we're going to chat about Sun Records and the history of Sun Records. And we're going to hear some interviews that Dan has captured over the years with guys who were at Sun, worked with Sam Phillips. And he did that through the NAMM Oral History Program, which is a huge collection that I think Dan is the best one to tell us about.
Well, thank you. This is exciting because this gives us an opportunity, finally at last, to showcase the depth of this collection that originally started because of the NAMM board got together in the late 1990s and said we really should be capturing the history of our industry, and that's the music products industry all around the globe. And so I was lucky enough to get the gig and have been in my favorite position and dream job ever since. And we've captured over 3,000 interviews as of 2016, and we continue to focus on recording those people who lived in our industry and changed it. Pioneers, people like music store owners, and those working in music manufacturing like Fender and Steinway, as well as music educators. And along the way, we've been able to put together these little pieces of the puzzle that tell a larger story, but can be very specific. So today it's exciting to assemble some of the interviews that talked about Sun Records there in Memphis, Tennessee, and why that was an important recording studio and some of the amazing things that were done there. So I'm really very grateful to Michael and Elizabeth for sort of putting the flame underneath me to actually do something about this great collection and utilize the media of this podcast. So I'm very hopeful that this will be the first chapter of many.
Yeah, so if you want to check out any of the interviews from some of the guys we hear today or anyone else out of the 3,000 plus we have, check out our website. It's NAMM.org/library, and you'll find the whole collection there. So I guess we can get started then.
Exciting. Where are we starting?
So our first clip that we have here is Matt Rospang. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, as far as I know. Dan would probably know best. Yeah.
Alrighty.
And so what's, I guess before we hear from him, Dan, you interviewed Matt a while ago, a couple years ago, I think.
At the Nashville NAMM show.
Yeah, so what's his background? How is he connected to Sun?
Well, he actually is a recording engineer, and he worked at Sun. At the time, it was still really focusing on special tours. And then he got into the element of recording there when they expanded and brought back live recordings to the studio just a couple of years ago, I understand.
So I think Matt in this clip is going to talk about what it was like to be at Sun, kind of the history of the studio, what the space was built like, really trying to give us a visual if you've never been able to see it. So let's hear from Matt.
Just being from Memphis, the music history of not only the blues guys like B.B. King and Ike Turner and Howlin' Wolf, Memphis Jug Band, but then you got Sun with Sam Phillips and Elvis and Carl, Jerry Lee, Roy Orbison, Johnny Cash. Then people like Willie Mitchell, who's a hero, who did Al Green, Otis Clay, and Peebles. And then you get in the 60s, I could go on forever, with Ardent, with Big Star and ZZ Top and Zeppelin 3. And then you get into the kind of the current mode. But all that stuff is kind of like just warped me into who I am today.
Right. I mean, Stax and High.
Oh, yeah. I forgot. I didn't even mention Stax. And there's American studios. A lot of people don't know American, but that's where the most hits in Memphis were ever cut. And then there's little-known labels like Gold Wax, which has got some of the most fantastic country soul music ever. That's where Dark End of the Street came out on that. And then, of course, Muscle Shoals is not far. Nashville's not far. So all that stuff just kind of took over me at a young age. And that's how it all happened.
That's fantastic. Let's talk about Sun a little bit.
Okay.
What was it like in there?
Well, Sun is, it's the birthplace of rock and roll. It's unchanged from the 50s, which is pretty amazing. And I love it because I'm a big proponent of people in a room together and feeding off each other and really not having a plan. Sam said they never went in there knowing what they were going to do. They just came in there, and he said, pull it out of their assholes. But but Sun, to me, is the essence of that. It's one room. There's no booths. The bleed in the control of the studio is so bad it goes in the control room, so you're kind of hearing stuff through the speakers and through the wall, and it's by no means the most perfect recording situation, but that's what's great about it. And the room just is alive. And so I spent 11 years there, and it really helped me become a great engineer about knowing how to. I tell everyone this is a people industry. The technical side is like 20% of it, and 80% of it is just being a good person and knowing how to talk to people and comfort people and stuff. Mm. And at Sun, everyone's coming there to make their dreams come true, and they're freaking out. I mean, it's hard to go in there and try and play your song when Johnny Cash is looking down at you and Elvis cutting there and stuff. So a big part of it was just getting people to calm down and open up and relax in the session. And then you got to know how to record a whole band live in a room with no separation and try and get a great vocal take and make everyone hear each other without headphones and stuff. So it really kind of shaped. That was a big part of my learning was trying to learn that room and figure out how to make it work. Sam did it with 4 microphones. So I could do it way more, but I started taking mic away from myself, and I bought all the same equipment he would have used. So we went live to mono tape, and I had a little lathe that could cut you a 45 when you were done. And trying to make a whole band work with 4 microphones can be pretty tough, but it can be exhilarating too because you play the console like an instrument, So it's cool to have everyone on the same wavelength and pressure.
That was a lot of information. A lot of names came out of there. So, Dan, those names all coming out of Sun, some big ones.
It's amazing. It really is, as he said, sort of the birthplace of rock and roll. And I think one of the things that's most amazing to me is the role that recording studio plays. It's located in Memphis, Tennessee, and best known for, of course, cutting Elvis Presley's first recordings. And then there was a string of hit records, as he mentioned, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, so many others. But to back up and to really understand why that was important, I think it might be fun to talk a little bit about Sam Phillips, his background, and how that studio began. Because to me, the uniqueness was that Sam Phillips was not afraid of recording African-American artists as a white record label owner. And more importantly, or maybe equally importantly, he wasn't afraid to record a white person singing African-American music, which of course became Elvis and the whole rockabilly movement after that. And in the South, at that time, that was sort of a big deal. I mean, we got to remember, this is around the time of Emmett Till. I think he was murdered in August of 1955, so this is a few years even before that. This is way before Rosa Parks. So this was at a time in the South where it was very difficult to mingle the two ethnic backgrounds and blend them together in music. It was very difficult for even white radio stations to play African-American music at that time.
And we have some clips that discuss that that we're going to get to in just a little bit as well, that we can dive into more about that aspect of Sam and how he was kind of a pioneer in that area. The other thing I found interesting about Matt's clip is they talked a lot about it's a unique recording space. I mean, as someone who's never been in a recording studio, maybe both of you guys know better than me, is it still completely different than what you'd see in a modern studio?
Absolutely. I think the funny thing that Matt brings up is how unprofessional, if I can use that word, it is on today's standards. We have to remember that was 60 years ago when it was first built. So a lot of the recording studios now take advantage of acoustic measurements and dynamics and all the studies that people have done, the wall treatments. All of these products that have been developed in a way to make the most out of whatever space is available. Back then, it didn't matter. He just had an open room. This is some place that he rented, Sam, we're talking about. and put some equipment in and said, okay, here's my studio. He didn't treat the walls. He didn't treat the ceilings. He didn't do anything to it. And that's why there was a lot of bleed that Matt was referring to.
And it's pretty incredible, the records that came out of there. Just a studio that wasn't even really a studio. It was just, 4 walls, 4 mics, and the gold that came out of there was just incredible. And following up on who Sam was, we have a clip here from W.S. Holland describing who Sam was.
Yeah, so, and for those of you who don't know, W.S. Holland was a really great drummer and played with Johnny Cash for quite a bit of his career. And was it Carl Perkins as well? Who else did he play
Correct.
with?
Yeah, he was he was a drummer for Blue Suede Shoes, a very famous Carl Perkins tune.
Yeah, and so he's a super nice guy, so we're going to hear from him next.
Sam Phillips was probably one of the most unusual characters that I was ever around. He might not have been the number one unusual character because I was around so many. But the one thing that he knew, a lot of people call Sam, even now and back then, a record producer. But in my view, he really wasn't a record producer. He had a record company, and people found him. Like Elvis found him, Carl found him, John found him, all the guys. And they go in the studio, and Sam was smart enough to just let us do what we could do. I don't ever remember him telling anybody that's singing or playing an instrument how to play it. He knew enough that he was hearing something that nobody had ever heard before. So he just let it happen. And to me, he had a special mind about him to listen to something and realize nobody had ever heard it before, so he let it happen. If you think about it, we'll just say if he had been a person that had gone to a college or some kind of school to learn record producing, like a lot of producers do, to go in the studio, well, no, you got to do this, that don't work. It wouldn't have happened. He could hear it and realize that it was something new. And I kind of kidded him later, though, after we did the $1 Million Quartet session. See, nobody thought anything about that night.
Very interesting. What's cool is a little bit of background on Sam. He was born in Florence, Alabama, which is the same place that Rick Hall, who later formed the very famous Muscle Shoals-based recording studio called Fame, was also born. He grew up picking cotton and got a job as a disc jockey in Florence, Alabama, before moving to Memphis. And in January of 1950, he opened the Memphis Recording Service. And a few years later, that same recording studio, of course, is where the Sun record label came from. So he was recording artists for other labels before Sun, which a lot of people may not know. People like Howlin' Wolf and B.B. King. I know at least a couple of Howlin' Wolf songs were released on Chess Records up in Chicago, recorded there in Memphis. So Sam was forging these relationships with other labels and realized, wait a minute, I can form my own label and maybe keep a little coin in my pocket, which was a smart move. And, of course, one of the first songs that was noted in March of 1950, recorded there in Memphis recording studio, was Rocket 88, considered by many people to be the first rock and roll song. So he was definitely there at the right time. He had the equipment and the know-how, and most importantly, I think he had the sensibility to find the talent and allow the talent to do, as WS just said, what they do. Yeah,
which brings us to our next great topic, probably your favorite, Dan. We're going to talk about the King.
Hey, I know a little something about him.
Just a little bit about Elvis. So we find out very quickly that Elvis gets signed and cuts his first record on Sun. Way to go, Sam. Good find, I guess.
Well, again, I think going back to what WS just told us, the artist basically found Sam. So the story goes that Elvis was interested in hearing what his voice would sound like on a record. So he saved his money and went in the studio on July 18th, 1953, and cut a song called My Happiness, which for many years people were told he recorded that for his mother and gave it to his mother for her birthday, which was the following month. Which, of course, could be very true, but I also think a lot of this had to do with Elvis being interested in saying, wait a minute, what would I sound like on record? So kind of a 1-2 punch. And as the story goes, Marion, who is the secretary there and also in charge of helping with the recordings with Sam, was there when Elvis came in. Sam was, I guess, on break, and she leaned over and recorded on a backup tape Elvis recording My Happiness, which you don't normally do. Tape was very expensive, but she wanted to play it back for Sam because she heard something different.
Right. Man, she should get a lot of that credit there, right?
Absolutely.
So we're going to hear from a couple people about Elvis and his process of getting discovered, I guess you could say, at Sun by Sam and Marion, then in turn. So our first up is Carl Mann. Do you want to give us a little background on him?
Sure. Carl Mann was born in rural Tennessee. He grew up in a family where both of his parents were in the lumber business. It was 1942, I believe he was born, and started singing and playing in church, as many of the other folks that we're going to be talking about today did. And his greatest claim to fame came a few years after Elvis, in 1959, when he recorded his version of Mona Lisa. But here is a very interesting interview with Carl Mann talking about the early days.
Then I met W.S. Holland, who was with Carl Perkins at the time. He played drums for Carl Perkins, and he became interested in my singing and came out to listen to me one night, and we got together, and he said, that maybe he had some influence over at Sun. He might be able to get me a record deal over there. Because I had already been to Sun several times with tapes, audition tapes, and they'd say, well, just leave the tape, we'll listen to it, get back with you. And that didn't work, I don't know if they ever listened to them or not, because when I got down there, they had a whole storeroom back there full of tapes. I guess there was a lot of kids starting out, that was sending them tapes and trying to get on Sun Records, after Elvis, man, that was the thing, Elvis, when I heard Elvis, Dewey Phillips played him on WHBQ, man, I thought, man, this guy's something, real different, and because it was such a raw sound, but yet it was great, And the first time I heard him play "That's All Right, Mama," man, it just done something to me, And so I started doing a lot of Elvis's songs, and but I was still doing country too, But
it's amazing. I was thinking when Carl was talking there about a couple of things that are extremely important to remember. When I was growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, a big Elvis fan, I was told a couple of things. One, that the main thrust of Sam connecting with Elvis was that Sam had always said to Marion and others, if he could find a white artist that sounded like a black performer, he'd make $1 million. And I don't know if that is exactly a quote, but that was sort of his concept. He was looking to expand from the African Americans that he was recording to bring the music that he was hearing in Beale Street and other places around Memphis that were combining these sounds. So a lot of the white artists that we're talking about, Roy Orbison and Johnny Cash and Elvis, all grew up in the church and understood that style of music, country music and church music, but also grew up around Memphis and, let's say, the other side of the tracks, and heard the blues and rhythm and blues. And when they would combine these together, really that became something unique and different. And so a lot of people, including myself, consider Sun Records to be really the birthplace of rockabilly, combining all of those sounds. And that's what Carl was talking about a little bit in that clip. And interestingly enough to me is the role that Dewey Phillips played, the DJ there in Memphis, who wasn't afraid to play African-American artists on his show, which was called the Red Hot and Blue. Dewey was actually related to Sam. They were second cousins, I believe, or something like that, and also very interested in playing music that you wouldn't hear elsewhere. When, as Carl Mann just had mentioned, that Dewey was playing Elvis for the first time, almost immediately Dewey brought Elvis down to the radio station and interviewed him live. And one of the points that he wanted to make very clear, without saying directly, "Are you Caucasian?" To tell the audience that this is not an African American, because he is singing African American songs and very bluesy and rhythm and blues. He asked Elvis, "What school do you go to?" And Hume's High at the time, of course, segregation and all of that, it was an all-white school. So that spoke volumes to the audience of who this kid Elvis was.
And one thing I find interesting that I'd, want to see what you guys think is, you mentioned that if it weren't for the country background of the region, the studio being in Memphis, the gospel influence and everything like that, do you think if Sun Records was placed anywhere else in the nation, the Northeast or the West Coast or anything like that, do you think the same sounds would have come out?
I think it would have been totally different. I think where it was located had a huge, it played a huge part in it. If it was more northern, or if it was on the east, or if it was like California coast or anything like that, I feel like it would have been totally different, and the people that would have went in there would have done different things. And I think the whole aspect of the studio would have been different too. I don't think they would have been so relaxed with how they recorded everything. I think they would have gone for all of the high tech stuff and the scientific ways of recording, if you can call it that.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Michael. I think it's interesting also that we think about some of the storied studios. They each have their own little niche. Like Stax Records there in Memphis had a slanted floor. It used to be a movie theater, and a lot of people thought that was sort of the mystique of it. There was somehow acoustically that was different. And of course, Motown had its very polished songs, brand new songs recorded by several of the artists that Berry Gordy and those in that whole system were grooming to be big stars like the Supremes and the Temptations, and they had their own little niche. Of course, out in on the West Coast, there was Gold Star Records that had an echo chamber that was made famous by the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds and Phil Spector and the Wall of Sound. So all of these sort of storied studios have a little bit of a niche sort of physically that you could point to and say, well, maybe that was this, maybe that was part of the sound. But as you said, Michael, I think you are absolutely right. That wasn't necessarily part of Sun Records. I think a lot of it had to do with its location and the people it attracted.
The most amazing part about all of that is Dan can recite all those dates and names without any notes in front of him. So,
I am an obsessed Elvis fan.
Just slightly. Speaking of Elvis, getting us back on track, how about we listen to one of your best buddies?
Well, Scotty Moore became my friend, and I'm very, very honored to say that. Believe me, it's a very humbling thing. When I was a kid growing up, I had my uncle's 45 of Elvis singing Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and I thought, who are those musicians on there? I mean, almost immediately, of course, I was taken by Elvis's voice, but I really wanted to know who else was in the band. And I had to go down to a place called a library physically. I know, this is kind of scary.
What's a library?
Yeah, thank you. And I brought the 45 with me, and I asked a reference librarian, who's on this? Who's the guitar player? Who's the drummer? And that's the first time I heard the name Scotty Moore playing the Gibson. What was interesting to me is I just grew up with that name. So having a job at NAMM in the early 2000s and getting to meet and get to know Scotty was just a complete honor. And the main thing I wanted to say about Scotty that you will probably hear in his voice as you hear part of this interview is that he's a humble guy. He was just kind of a country bumpkin. You know, he always said that when they first started recording, they were amateurs. They didn't know what they were doing. They were just a bunch of kids. And they grew up very quickly, of course. If you consider one interesting fact, Elvis and Scotty and Bill Black on bass, this is before the drummer, July 5th, 1954, they recorded That's All Right Mama. That's the first time they got together. So from July of 1954 to January of 1956 is when Elvis recorded Heartbreak Hotel on RCA. And, of course, that was the beginning of his stardom and these huge gold records. So not a whole lot of time in between for these amateurs to all of a sudden become big stars and get used to screaming girls and television cameras and all the like. So it's a very interesting transition for all of them. But in the end, I think Scotty remained who he always was. He wasn't flashy. He was just a very humble kind of guy.
Yeah, and if you want to see that, again, check out our website to see the video that accompanies the audio you're about to hear, and you can see that clip at namm.org/library. That's NAMM.org/library. So here's Scotty.
Do you remember the first time you met Elvis?
Yeah. This is July. It was July 4th, 48 years ago. This past the last 4th of July. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he came over to my house.
Did you know he was coming?
48 years, my Lord.
You're too young for that. Is this a story that Sam set you up, that you were going to get together? Or?
Well, there's been so many variations of it. The group I was talking about earlier, the Starlight Wranglers, when I put that group together, and then I got a little radio show for us. Then I heard about this studio, this guy that had a studio, and you could go in and make your own record. Or he was doing some records for some other people, for other labels. And so I went to see it, and this was Sam, it was Memphis Recording Service. And the Sun Records was just a side thing. He was trying to land some kind of, get a hit any which way. And he had sense enough to know what he was doing. He was cutting R&B stuff for mainly Chess Records in Chicago, I think. And so anyway, I went to see him, and he said, "Yeah, bring the band in," because he was dabbling around in country music also. And we went in and played several things for him, and he liked it. He said, "You got a good group, good tight." He said, "But do you have any original material?" "Nope." He said, "Well, I really don't see any, percentage in recording other people's material. And so if you get some original material, come back and see me." Well, I went out and wrote 2 songs, and then gave Poindexter, the singer, part of it, and my oldest brother part of it, because he could read music, and he wrote the lead sheet so he could copyright the darn thing. I mean, I was really business wise back then.
That's great.
Anxiousness can get you in trouble if you're not careful. But anyway, I got 2 songs. We went back and told Sam, I got a couple of songs, and he said, "Okay, come in, we'll listen again." He liked both songs, and he cut the record.
What was the song?
One song was My Kind of Carrying On, and gosh, my mind went blank. What is the other side? Can't remember offhand.
But you were pretty happy with it?
Well, I didn't have sense enough to know what was a hit record if I heard it, you know. What I was looking for is that, okay, I got this little radio show. Now, if I got a record, I could get it played on the radio some and get hopefully more weekend gigs, because all the band had daytime jobs, you know. And
so at the time of that recording, if you can recall, did you have aspirations of being a professional musician?
Yes and no. I mean, what all I wanted was to have a band. I couldn't sing. I wanted to have a band, and wanted to play. Now, I hadn't really got that far into it. Is this going to be a 7-day a week, or 1 day a week, or what? As long as I could play some. It's just like an itch you had to scratch, you know. And so anyway, the record that he put out, we probably sold 12, I guess, maybe. I don't know if we even gave any away or not, but might have pressed 25 if you could. But from this experience, Sam and I became good friends. And there was a restaurant next door to the studio. Now, everywhere I read, I keep reading, Scotty hanging around Sun Studio. I didn't hang around Sun Studio. I would go down if Sam wasn't working. I wouldn't even go in the studio. I'd go in the front office part and see if he was working. If he was working, I'd go on. And if he wasn't, well, I'd wave at him or something. We'd go next door and have coffee and just chit-chat for 30, 45 minutes. That was my hanging around, was at the restaurant, really. And then that's through him and having coffee over there. And his secretary is actually, Marion is one that actually, one day she said, what about, we were just talking about the business in general. Did you hear such and such a record? How'd you like the sound on this? And neither one of us. I'm looking to get out of work, I guess, and been in the back of my mind, and he's looking for a hit, you know, because he's got a job at WREC radio. So he was engineering down there on the side. And he started his studio as a separate, just hoping to get something going there, which he did. And
so she was actually part of.
See, Elvis had been in there and made this record for his mother about a year prior to when I was there for a birthday. When we was having coffee, she asked him if he remembered, because she had kept his address, and I think had got him to listen to the tape and such. Years went by, and I finally found out that he had been back in again. Actually, Sam had called him again. We were having coffee one day, and Marion, Sam's secretary, had joined us, and she brought up Elvis's name. Asked Sam, said, "What do you think about what was in about a year ago?" Said, and Sam kind of he didn't really say anything, just kind of nodded his head, and so old instigator me. Then over the next couple of weeks, every time I'd see him go by, I said, "You think about that guy? Did you call him yet or anything?" And so finally, after a couple of weeks, again, Marion was having coffee with us, and he turned to her, just kind of said, "Marion, have you got his phone number in the file?" And she said, "Oh yeah." She said, "Well, go get it and bring it back." And he turned to me and said, "Give it to Scotty. and said, Scott, if you call a guy and get him to come over to your house and see what you think about him. And that instant, it was kind of like, just quit bugging me. But and I probably was, And, so she went and got the telephone number, and this was on a Saturday, and when I got home that afternoon, I called, and he wasn't home, but talked to his mother, and told her I was something. I said, I'm working with Sam Phillips at Sun Records. So I still didn't know that he had actually been in there. Besides that, this call came out in years. Neither Sam nor Elvis had ever mentioned that over the years.
Is that right?
Yeah, I don't know why. But anyway, I called him. He called me, and I asked him again. Told him I was kind of looking for talent and stuff for Sun Records. Would he be interested? And he said, "Yeah, I guess so." So I got him come over to my house on Sunday, which was the 4th of July. And he came over, and we spent a couple hours. He sang. It seemed like he knew every song in the world. He didn't know the chords to them. He'd play along, and when he got to where he didn't know it, he just quit playing, keep singing, come back, and start playing again. I think he had a sponge for a brain for lyrics. Just he knew them. And Bill Black lived up the street a few doors. He came down and listened a little bit. His bass was at my house, but we didn't play, and he just came in, listened a few minutes, and left.
You had played with him before.
Well, he was part of the Strike Wranglers band.
Oh, okay.
So we were. Elvis left, and I called Sam, and I told him, I said, the boy sings, good. He's young. Seems like he knows every song. But I'd learned my lesson. I said, but he doesn't have any original material now. And Sam said, well, said I tell you what, said, just you and Bill come in tomorrow night, studio. Now, he said, I'll call Elvis at home, and asked him to come in. And after I thought about it later, the reason he called him and said come in, I gave it legitimacy, that I wouldn't, just wasting time or anything. But he asked, said, just you and Bill come in. Said, don't bring the whole band. Said, all I want is just to see what he sounds like with a little music with him. And this was the real audition. I did a pre-audition, and then when we went in on the Monday night, that was the audition. Then the first side of the first record came out of the audition. We didn't go in to cut a record. It just fell into it.
Is that right?
Yeah.
But you did full takes as if it were, right?
On some other stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll tell you a little side note there that Sam kept some of those. Harbor Lights was one where we just try. Blue Moon, that was a pre-cut that night. There's 2 or 3 others, and he kept some of those. Well, from then on, every time we did a new record, we go in. We actually worked it the same way. We went in and, well, you think of anything today we could try? No, did you? How about this? Let's try. We go through these things. Sam would put them on tape. We'd listen to them. No, that's not. We thought we had a style then. We had to find this thing that would work. But he didn't keep any of this later stuff. Tape was, he wasn't working on a shoestring, and tape cost money. And that's always been a mystery to me why he kept those first few things, and then later on didn't.
That is very good.
Not even any outtakes or anything. You don't find any outtakes. There's a couple of breakdown things they found later after he sold everything to RCA, but in general there was not, because he'd back up and we'd do it again.
Do you recall any of those songs that just never got the light of day?
Not really. We tried a little bit of everything. And you may have read, and there's things that people say, well, didn't y'all cut a bluegrass thing called Uncle Pen? And we may have run it. We may have tried it. But I don't remember. So many things we tried. We were doing some things we had two songs, one record, man. We started doing shows. We had to work up something that would at least do 15 minutes. I mean...
You had to put a show together quick.
Something, and it's something that would fit 3 people the way we were playing it. And, gosh, the only group we even knew that back then that was like Bill Carlisle. I don't know if you ever heard the Carlisles. He did comedy type songs, but there was like a 3-piece group, 3 or 4, very small. But we did some Chuck Berry stuff on the road. Some of that got recorded later from different angles.
Maybelline and things like that.
Maybelline, yeah. Teresa Brewer, Tweedledee Dee. These were things that we were just going down the highway and hear something and say, as soon as we get to where we're going, we'll try that, see if we can work something out of that.
I can't even imagine pre-auditioning Elvis and then not shouting it from the rooftops afterwards.
It's interesting. Scotty was talking about the Starlight Wranglers, which was a band that he put together, and they did record very country type of music on Sun before he connected with Elvis. And Billy Black is on the bass. Just a little shout out. Billy was born in 1926, passed away in 1965. Was a critical part of the trio. They called themselves the Blue Moon Boys when they toured around. I'm looking at a picture of them now. And those were the early days that Scotty was talking about. But it's interesting, if you ever have the chance to listen to the Starlight Wranglers recordings on Sun, what you will find, as I discovered, is Scotty's unique sound was even on those country tunes. And it wasn't just the ES-335 Gibson that he was playing, although that is a unique sounding instrument. It was the way Scotty played that has been emulated by many and influenced by even more. The Beatles talked about it. Brian Setzer recently told us about that, his influence of Scotty's sound. So it's really cool to hear that even before Elvis, he had already developed a sound. He just sort of honed it into this now rockabilly style that Elvis was all about. So a very interesting early days of rock and roll right there.
And we recently lost Scotty Moore, right? In the last year or so?
Yeah, he passed away on June the 28th of 2016. And it was after some illness, so not a shock to some of us, but it's very difficult to think about it without him. I loved getting phone calls from Scotty and just talking. He was a really great guy. My favorite story about Scotty I'd love to share with you is the first time I went to his house, which, by the way, was on a street called Blueberry Hill, which I thought was great. Really up in the hills there above Nashville. It took me forever. I felt like I was driving to another country. And when I finally got out of my car, he met me, came out to the porch. And I said, Scotty, where's the next neighbor? And he said, like 3 miles away. And I said, why are you in the middle of nowhere? And he just had this cute little sigh and said, no screaming girls.
I guess he dealt with that enough in his life, right?
Traumatized from that moment.
I venture to say most men would probably not feel the same, but... Oh, boy. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about Elvis a little bit later. But we're going to kind of circle back around to a concept you brought up earlier, Dan, and that's Sam Phillips and Son recording before Elvis and kind of their roots in giving African Americans a chance to record, which wasn't really existent before him. So who are we going to hear from next, Mike?
So first we're going to hear from Carl Mann, actually.
Yeah, which we heard from him earlier, so
yep, yeah, and
no bio needed.
Right, and this time we're going to hear him talk about Carl Perkins and Elvis' influence on Sun, and also Sam recording black artists.
Carl is known as the Rockabilly King, but I think Elvis was, his stuff was Rockabilly, when he first came out, because he was doing bluegrass, rock, and then he was doing old blues stuff. A lot of that stuff he did was stuff that some of the black artists had done on Sun. Sam recorded a lot of black artists before he ever got Elvis. I'm sure you guys know that, but he had B.B. King, Ike Turner, and Rufus Thomas, and a lot of the black artists. In fact, I think he was about the only studio in Memphis at the time that gave the black artists a chance, to record the blues and stuff that they did. Of course, that was blues capital of the world, I guess, Memphis blues, or New Orleans. So it all came together, as a new American music. New style of American music. It took the public a while to accept that, with Elvis. But
so that's Carl Mann talking a little bit about the early days of the Memphis recording service that was established in 1950 by Sam Phillips, and of course became the same location of Sun Records a few years later. And some of the early recordings of African-American blues artists that Sam went around the Beale Street and other places, it started with a guy whose nickname was originally the Beale Street Blues Boy, later cut down to BB, and that was B.B. King. Howlin' Wolf, Roscoe Gordon, Rufus Thomas, Little Milton, and two major influences on Elvis, Little Milton and Junior Parker, along with the great harp player, mouth harp, I'm talking about the harmonica, James Cotton. All recorded there at the Memphis recording studios.
Yeah, and I think one thing we have to remember is, at the time the country was in turmoil, like you mentioned. Civil rights movement was getting ready to get in full swing, and there was a whole bunch of division, especially in the South. And so these guys probably would have never had the opportunity to record, let alone record for what was going to become such a big name studio. So to kind of comment on that a little bit, and the difference between rockabilly versus rhythm and blues is a new voice, Sonny Burgess. So Dan, what can you tell us about Sonny?
He is known as the wild man of rockabilly, and as of the time of this taping in 2017, he is still on the road with his band, many of which we were able to interview for the NAMM Oral History program several years ago. Sonny is a very talented individual who both wrote and recorded his own songs along with some others, and really, I think, became sort of the quintessential rockabilly artist, certainly of the late 1950s, and continues to promote that style of music.
Yeah, I think he's really big on the festival circuit out in Europe. So if you ever get lucky enough to get out there and see him, definitely check it out.
Yeah, so now we're going to jump to a clip of him talking about rockabilly versus rhythm and blues.
There never seemed to be too much of a division between black and white artists. And yet, so many of the guys who play rockabilly are white. And Sam had guys in his studio who were both. Did you ever?
Yeah.
Well,
I never seen a black rockabilly.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah.
Because
But-
you could call it rhythm and blues. If
Yeah, it's
black
rhythm
guy,
and
right?
blues,
Yeah.
or race music, they used to call it, but rhythm and blues, what we called it back in. That's true. The rockabilly, I don't like the term really, but if that's what they want to call us, that's fine with me. It don't. So we'll be rock. But we, like Bobby said, we were rock and rollers, man. We were dyed-in-the-wool rock and rollers. We wanted to play as loud as we could. We played as loud as we could, except your speaker was a little 12-inch. You had two 12-inch speakers, deal about this tall and about that wide, and you could set the 25-watt Bogan amp in the bottom of it, fast together, and you could carry it in one hand. That was the PA set. No monitors. We had maybe if we were lucky, we had 2 or 3 microphones. But we played as loud as we could with what we had. If we'd have played that equipment like that nowadays, of course, we'd have played, man, we'd have blown the walls out. But now talking about the black rockabilly, I always considered the guys like Elvis when he started. That's what I call true rockabilly. It was a 3-piece guys, and then maybe they added drums to it later on. But the bass, the rhythm guitar, and the guitar, and then the drums. That's what I call true rockabilly. When you added more, see, we had a 6-piece band, which is what we've got now. We got a fiddle, sax player, and now. But back then we had the trumpet, 2 basses, upright bass, and a electric bass, thanks to Johnny Ray. That was unheard of back then. And Billy Lee Riley was the only other one back then that had the big band. He came on a little bit after us on Sun.
So he just kind of briefly mentions the difference between, and so do you, Dan, on the interview, between rockabilly and then rhythm and blues. So what would be, I guess, your guys' 2 thoughts on that? Like, why is it that if it's rockabilly, it's all white people, and if it's rhythm and blues, it's usually all black artists? Why not the crossover?
That's a really good question. And I have a feeling that most of it has to do with the times. You know, as you mentioned earlier, there was a hotbed of racial tension happening. Segregation still wasn't a word that most people wanted to talk about. And I think that was a real clean, easy way back in those days to have both of those artists being recorded at the same studio without it becoming a major event.
So maybe the division was necessary to get people out there to listen to it.
I think you're right.
At the time. I mean,
certainly people to play it, too, because you have to also remember that there were, as strange as it sounds now, there were white radio stations. There were African-American radio stations, and that's what they played. They didn't mix. There were jukeboxes that didn't play both white artists and African-American artists. And it's really strange to think that, wait a minute, the color of the skin isn't necessarily something that you're going to hear. But that, I guess, goes back to the point that Dewey Phillips was trying to make when he asked Elvis if he went to high school at Humes High School, which was segregated, and it was clear that was a white artist. It was unclear to people listening if somebody like Elvis is influenced by African Americans and playing rhythm and blues, what color is that guy's skin? Back then, it mattered to a lot of people, unfortunately, and so those points had to be made.
Yeah, which just makes you think about how much music people missed out on caring about stuff like that. I mean, great artists and great tracks.
Yeah, I'm sure people didn't even think to cross over to listen to it either, you know? Yeah. I think it must have really just been like, oh, you either listen to that style or that style. There probably wasn't much crossing over until Elvis happened.
Right.
And I think another sort of taboo that Elvis addressed was mixing not only country music and rhythm and blues together, but also his influence on gospel music and the church music. My goodness, back then that was a big no-no to talk about blues and gospel music together. I mean, there were people that were thrown out of their churches, even longtime parishioners, if they would sing the blues. Thomas A. Dorsey is a great example of that. When he was playing the blues, he was not considered a church follower or a Christ follower, even though he certainly was a minister. So those are the kind of things that we sometimes lose sight of. And when Elvis used that influence, it was a big deal.
Yeah, so to hear more about it, we're going to hear from another new voice, J.M. Van Eaton. What do we know about him?
He was a drummer, a studio drummer that did a lot of different sessions there at Memphis Recording Studio, and of course released on Sun Records over the course of his career, beginning in the 1950s, and a very charming man. Another time that we had the opportunity to sit down with somebody who you really felt like, wow, this is the kind of guy I want to be friends with.
All right, so let's hear him talk about the same subject, about Sam recording white and black musicians.
Was there a lot of black musicians playing with white musicians at Sun, or was that not too common?
Well, it wasn't that it wasn't something they wanted to do. It just didn't happen that much. There was a horn player that came in and played on a couple of those sessions. His last name was Ford. I can't remember his first name. I did record with a couple of black artists there. They cut two artists while I was in my time frame there, and one guy was named Bill Pinkney, and Bill Pinkney was the bass singer for the Drifters. He was, and somehow Bill Justice ran across him when they were on tour somewhere and heard him singing, and he brought him back to Sun, and we did, as far as I know, he only had one record out, but we did that, and I cut another with a guy named Jeb Stewart, and he was more like a Jackie Wilson type singer with the dancing and all that, and he was very, very good, and we did maybe 2 or 3 songs, or maybe 4 or 5 records on him, but never could get a hit record on him, but that was the only couple. I think after I left, they brought in a black drummer, played Al Jackson, I think, played on a few records over there at the tail end of my era, But most of that happened at Stax, where they mixed the guys. And I talked to my friend. I said, man, I talked to some of the black artists, which I love, but I said, man, y'all ought to be thankful. Sam Phillips, he quit once Elvis came. Sam honestly just quit recording black artists. Prior to that, that's all he recorded. I mean, he had Little Milton and guy, it was unbelievable.
Junior
the people
Parker,
that yeah. But I said, man, what it did, he'd opened the door for Stax to start recording you guys, and they parlayed that into a gold mine over there, and cut some great records there, which they probably would have never gotten to do if they'd stayed at Sun, to be honest about it. I don't know if Sam would have had that vision. Like the Axtons and, those people.
Right.
So it's hard to say, but I said, man, don't be bitter at Sam. I said, he really did you a favor. He got you in a studio that could help you. Yeah. And Rufus Thomas was one that was kind of bitter about it. Rufus was his son, and but he got over it. I mean, once you go somewhere else and do good. But they had some good studios there, man. Willie Mitchell and them over at High Records, they cut some good records.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Must have been frustrating to get, as a black artist, to have this opportunity opened up to you to record with Sam, and then Elvis kind of stumbles along, and then he's a priority at Sun, and you have to find other work. But it makes me wonder, if it wasn't for that door being opened, how would have things changed down the line? Obviously, African Americans recording professionally and studios opening up would have happened. I think it's the natural course of American history. But how much later? In what sense? I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, definitely a turning point in music history.
We're gonna move forward with talking about Sam Phillips and playing African American music, black music at Sun and recording those. And we're gonna hear from Ike Turner, and that is the Ike Turner that you probably know of. But just in case you don't have much familiarity with him, he was one of the first rock and rollers, right, Dan?
That's right. I think that we now know his name in sort of a negative light because of his relationship with Tina Turner and the movie that came out about his very abusive attitude towards her and other people. And quite frankly, just to make a note of this for whatever historical purpose it might fill, when we at NAMM recorded this interview with him, it was not without some people being very negative about it. However, I felt it was very important to document his view on his role as a musician in the early days of rock and roll, certainly in the era of pioneer. He is inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a result of the early contributions that he made, even prior to getting together with Tina, which I think is very important. He was among the first to record a Fender Stratocaster, for example. He was also playing the piano on what is considered to be the very first rock and roll song, Rocket 88.
And I think people have to remember that it's a job of a historian, whether they're a music historian or they teach college or write books or anything in between, is to document it all and to record it all. So like Dan said, even though a lot of Ike Turner's past is not ideal, it's important that we got a story. So, the music products industry and NAMM does owe Dan a little head nod for looking past all that and doing what's right for the profession. So let's hear from Ike.
Sam Phillips and Dewey Phillips was good friends. Dewey Phillips was the hottest disc jockey in the South. Music that we played back in those days was called race music. So white radio stations didn't play race music. So Sam Phillips got Dewey Phillips to play Rocket 88 on his show, and all the white kids went flying to Woodworth and all of those kind of stores to buy the record, and that's when they found out that white kids would buy black records. So now what Sam Phillips wanted to do was find him a white boy that sounded like a black boy, and anyway, that's where Elvis came from, and what's his name? I thought I said Joey Lewis. No,
Jerry
D. Lewis.
Right.
That's where all these guys came from, playing this kind of stuff.
Very.
And Little Richard, like he admits, and you can't get Little Richard to admit nothing. He admits in my book that I wrote, Taking Back My Name, he said he stole the intro off of Rocket 88. That's the intro to, I think it's Good Golly Miss Molly.
Yeah.
Say he took it off note for note.
A very interesting character, to say the least. You can probably pick up on some of the nuances of his personality just by listening to him.
Our next episode will be the conclusion of Sun Records, which will include topics such as the Sun sound, recordings that happened at Sun, and the infamous $1 Million Quartet. So make sure you check that out when we come back next time. Thanks for listening to the latest episode of the Music History Project. If you have any episode suggestions or any comments, please feel free to email us at library@namm.org.
And thank you to Zach Phillips for the writing and recording of our theme song.